Swayam Prabha. Digital India. Educated India.
Dear viewers, in this lecture, I will be discussing the utility of remote sensing and GIS for identifying economic, industrial and airport areas close to urban areas. The case study is again for the country of Laos DPR. Vientiane, pronounced as Vientiane, literally means the city of sandalwood. It is the capital city of Laos, situated in the Mekong Valley. It is also Laos' largest city. The estimated population of the city is close to 200,000 as per the census survey of 2005. Vientiane is located at 17 degrees 58 minutes north and 102 degrees 36 minutes east. Vientiane province is made up of the following districts: Chantaburi, Hatsafong, Mae Pak Num, Nai Sai Thong, Sang Thong, Sitkabong, Sitank, Zetsata and Zethani. So, these are the 11 districts which comprise the province of Vientiane, capital city. This place is known for its tourist locations. The first is Wat Sai Saket, which is a Buddha temple, and it is close to the Vientiane capital center. The next important tourist location is Patusai, that is the Victory Gate. This is a monument which the Laos DPR government has built in commemorating its independence from the French authorities in the year 1975, and it is also close to the National Assembly Council building of the country. One of the very famous temples, Pha That Long, is also located close to Patusai, that is the Victory Monument. The beauty of this particular tourist location that it houses the Buddha in its original posture. The beauty of this particular temple is that the total outside is made out of timber and painted with gold paint. Close to this is the monastery where the Buddhist monks undergo Buddhist related studies, so that they can then take up this as a career long profession. Another important tourist location is the Laos National Museum. This museum is dedicated to the various aspects of the country's cultural, economic and historical artifacts, and also provides a thorough knowledge as towards the history of the country. About 25 kilometers away from Vientiane city is the Buddha Park. The beauty of this particular park is that it has lot of figurines depicting various cultural artifacts and mascots related to the Lao culture. There are many ethnic races and it depicts the various mascots. Each of the ethnic races have been worshipping in their daily life. This particular slide shows some of the important tourist locations within Vientiane city capital, wherein on Google Earth wherein one can see the location of the National Museum, the Patusai and the Phao That Luang temple. With this background, I now take you over and describe what is the objective of the study which has been undertaken. The objective is to prepare urban development maps for economic, industrial and airport using remote sensing and GIS. As we all know, for a GIS based analysis, the first step is to create a GIS database, and this database would be used for creating different zones. So, the various inputs which have been taken in order to undertake this particular study are Wenchang administrative boundary maps, satellite images, land use and land cover maps, road network maps, water resources map, built up area map, contour and DEM, protected area map, existing infrastructure map, important tourist place map, proposed railway line map and proposed 450-year highway map. This slide gives you a overall picture of the Wenchang capital city province and its location within the Lao DPR country. The next slide shows the various districts within the Wenchang province. The satellite images which were used were primarily spot data for this particular study in order to create the land use and land cover map. Since the area is quite big, a mosaic of the satellite images had to be created, for which proper georegistration of all the images had to be performed. The georegistration RMS value was kept to be 0.4 pixel. With this registration criteria, the mosaic of all these satellite images were carried out for subsequent analysis. The major task to which the satellite image was subjected to was for the preparation of the land use map. In order to prepare the land use map, a thorough investigation of the area was undertaken, and on the basis of the information provided from various sources, that is from government reports, from other government agencies, there were 7 major land use cover which were identified, and these were agriculture, dense forest, open forest, sandy areas, urban areas, vegetation and water bodies. Thereafter, from the various informations which were collected earlier, a road network map was prepared, and these were classified into 2 categories: main roads and other roads. This information is important because it provides connectivity between any two points and is very useful when one is considering the regions where the suitable economic or industrial or airport areas can be identified. Similarly, the major river map was also created. This was to see that the economic zones or the industrial areas are not too far away from the water bodies. Other minor drainages, reservoirs and ponds were also identified and digitized, and this particular map is what we call it as the water resources map, which shows what are the different water sources and their locations and how these could be utilized for providing water for different zoning areas. Furthermore, it was also important that these should also not be polluted by the pollutants which may be discharged into the drainage. Next is the urban and the rural areas as point features. This is important because we may have to carry out certain buffering analysis. Also, the built up areas were also created as polygons, so that one would know where are the urban areas, so that the industrial or economic regions are not very close to the built up area, in order to have certain requirements of environmental constraints which were defined. Loud DPR has a very vast forest resource, and there have been many national biodiversity conservation areas identified. These areas are to be not to be considered during the analysis process. So, it was important to have the protected area map available to us, so that the economic or industrial or airport areas are not close to them. In order to have economic zones identified properly, it was necessary to identify the important tourist places. Ground information plays a very major role. So, information related to the ground was made available from topographical maps. All spot elevations available were digitized and stored as point features. Subsequently, the contours also available on the topographic maps were also digitized. The map information was available at a scale of 1:250,000, and thus a contour interval of 50 meter was available. One can see that at this contour interval, the major portion of the province has very little information in terms of the contours which are there. The contour values vary from 150 meters to 1000 meters. Based on these informations as available from the spot levels and the contour maps, a DM was generated, and based on the DM generation, the secondary product of slope map was created. Here the slope has been identified in 6 different categories: less than 5%, 5 to 15%, 15 to 25%, 25 to 35%, 35 to 45% and greater than 45%. It is interesting to note that there are several regions where the slope is more than 45%, which means that there are very steep mountains existing in this particular area. By and large, the slope in this region can be construed to have an average slope of ranging between 15 to 25%. This is an useful information when one has to identify the sites for economic and industrial areas. Another important aspect was the existing infrastructure. So, this particular map shows the existing airport and the railway line. It is interesting to note that for a railway line, a very small line is being depicted. In loud DPR, railway lines are not very common, and in order to provide rapid transport system within the country, the government is now focusing on creating railway line infrastructure. This is the immediate action plan which the government has identified for improving the existing infrastructure. The black line shows the proposed new railway line which the government has approved as a part of its 450-year celebration of its existence. Similarly, it has also passed and approved a new highway which is known as the 450-year highway, and this provides connectivity between Lao DPR and the country of Thailand. This road connects the Thailand over a bridge which is called as the Friendship Bridge. This slide shows the zoomed view of the two existing the proposed infrastructure, and one can see how the infrastructure is to be created and the regions that it would be connecting. Having had this information incorporated into the GIS database, now we have to identify what could be the suitable zones within which these activities could be undertaken, which means we are now going to create buffer zones within the GIS environment. For creating the buffer zones, certain criteria had been evolved. These criterions have been provided by the Lao DPR government, and the buffer zones which have been taken is that it should be 100 meters from the highway, 100 meters from reservoirs and ponds which have an area greater than 0.6 hectare, 500 meters away from built up areas whose area coverage is greater than 50 hectares, and 5,000 meters away from the present airport. So, based on this, the buffer zones for roads were created. The buffer zone was of 100 meters, and the red lines depict the major buffer zones along the major roads which are existing in this particular province. Similarly, the buffer zone for reservoirs and ponds have been of areas greater than 0.6 hectares have been created, and the red outlines along the water bodies show the buffer zones within which the activities will not be undertaken. Similarly, for built up area greater than 50 acres, a buffer zone of 500 meter has been identified, and the red color shows the buffers around major built up areas in this particular province. Similarly, the buffer zone for the airport has also been identified, and one can see the green circle at the bottom of the province which identifies the 5-kilometer range within which no activity or no airport will be proposed. There were certain constraints also in the planning, and these constraints were that the protected areas will not be encroached upon, there will be no disturbance to forest areas with open forest greater than 50 hectares, and all those areas where paddy crop is being grown. Rice is the staple food of Lao DPR, and thus there has been a government promulgation that all those areas which are undertaking paddy growth will not be disturbed. This particular slide shows the protected areas that are there within this particular region. The pink color polygons are depicting the protected areas. Similarly, the forest mask also has been identified, that is, these would be the areas where no activity would be undertaken, and these are shown in black color. So, these are the areas one can say they would be unsuitable for any developmental activities. The other areas like the yellow, they show the agricultural and the vegetation areas, red shows the urban, and blue shows the water body locations. Having had these buffers created, the next step is to undertake the process of overlaying of the different buffer maps which have been created. The buffer maps which were created were for roads, reservoirs and ponds, river, built up areas and existing airports. Furthermore, there were certain constraint maps like for protection areas, forest areas and paddy crop areas. With this information, the areas which were suitable for planning were identified, that is, the areas should be away from these buffer maps and constraint maps. So, if for major roads they should be outside 100-meter, reservoirs and pond greater than 0.6 they should be outside 100 meters, built up areas greater than 50 hectares they should be outside 500 meters, existing airport outside 5 kilometers, and for paddy, forest and protected areas these would be outside this particular region. So, with this particular information we now prepare what we call it as the suitability map, that is overlaying the constraints and identifying and using the different buffer maps that have been created, we identify which are the regions which are suitable. So, all the black areas in the province are those areas which are unsuitable for any developmental activities as per the constraints which are given. With this information, we now proceed towards modeling in GIS for identification of areas of development. So, first of all, we look at the buffer zones that we have created. From Wenchang city center, a 15-kilometer buffer for economic development activities, 25-kilometer buffer for industrial developmental activities, and 35-kilometer buffer for new airport. That is, within this particular region, the areas for development would be identified for the above 3 activities as per the scope of the study. So, these buffer zones as have been identified are now superimposed over the slope map, so that one can get a feeling as to what type of slope would be existing in the given buffer zones, so that there should not be too much of variation in terms of the ground. So, the 3 concentric circles about the Wenchang city have been shown. The innermost is the 5-kilometer, it is the 15-kilometer buffer. The middle one is the 25-kilometer buffer, and the outside ring is the 35-kilometer buffer. Based on this, these buffer zones are now superimposed over the suitability map in order to find out what is the zonation areas, or which are the suitable zonation areas, and this is what we call it as the zonation map. So, we can now see that which would be the areas wherein the different types of activities can be undertaken, and on the basis of the information now available we proceed ahead. So, when we go for identifying the economic developmental activities, there are certain minimum criteria to be maintained, and that is that the economic developmental areas must have a minimum area between 1500 to 2000 hectares of land. There should be proximity to roads, and thereby we have created a buffer of 100 meters, that is, the economic zone should be so located that it should be within 100 meters of the existing road, and also proximity to the tourist places which are there. So, based on this criteria, economic zone map has been identified, and one can see the new economic zone which is shown in orange color, and over that the hashed pink lines indicate the previously identified economic zone. The advantage that has been accrued by this particular study is that the area which was earlier identified was smaller in extent, and now a larger area can be used for developing the economic developmental plans. This particular area is nearly 2230 hectares in area, and thus it meets the minimum criterion conditions for identifying the economic zone. In order to check that the identification of this economic zone is proper, the economic zone was then imposed over Google Map and verified that it should not encroach over existing population areas and that there is open land available for developmental activities. So, this particular slide shows that the area which has been identified, it is close to the highways and roads which are there, and there are sufficient open lands for development. For identifying suitable areas for industrial developmental activities, the minimum area constraint was 2000 hectares. There should be road connectivity and in future connectivity to railway line, because this is going to be the lifeline for the subsistence of the industrial activities, so that the goods raw material can be sent to the industrial areas and the finished products can be sent to the market areas. So, based on this, the industrial zone was identified. Earlier, a industrial zone was identified and it was observed that this industrial zone was not properly located because it was encroaching beyond the buffer zone, which was identified that it should be within 15 to 25 kilometers. A major part of the previously identified industrial zone is within the range of 15 to 25 kilometers. So, based on this, a new industrial zone was identified, wherein proper care was taken that this falls over suitable regions. So, the brown color polygon that we see now is the new industrial zone which has been proposed for development. This industrial zone meets the minimum criteria of 2000 hectares and it has a present area of 3069 hectares, which is sufficiently good enough to develop the industrial activities. For verification, this particular zone was then superimposed over Google Map, and what we can see is that the yellow polygon shown on the Google Earth map falls entirely over a region which is uninhabited and there is open land and there would be very minimal disturbance to the existing population as such. This helps us in verifying that the decision which has been taken using GIS based approaches and analysis is meeting the criteria on the ground. The third developmental activities was to identify a new airport. The present airport is sufficient enough to take up small aircrafts and it is close to the Wenchang capital city. It is about 3 kilometers from the city center. So, there is a danger of the population which is living close by to the airport area. In fact, because of the location of this particular airport, at present there is a prohibition that all buildings will not be greater than 3 stories, and thus in Wenchang capital cities one does not find high skyscrapers existing. With the country to develop and the capital city to develop, it is necessary that many foreign investments may be carried out, which would mean that there is going to be a tremendous need for new buildings to be built up, and thus there is a need for the airport to be shifted to a different location. The new airport which is to be developed within a buffer zone which is 25 to 35 kilometers from the city center. It must have a minimum area of 7000 hectares. The land should be gentle sloping, that is, the slope should be varying between 5 to 15%. There should be adequate road connectivity and also it must maintain a good distance from the hills. So, based on this, the new airport area was identified Previously the government had undertaken a study and it had identified a airport region which is shown by blue hash dots, and one can see that this particular airport area defined is within the defined limits of the 25 to 35 kilometer buffer, but probably does not meet the minimum area requirements. So, based on that, a new area has been now identified, which has an area of about 7,836 hectares in order to develop the whole airport complex. This new proposed airport zone has now been superimposed over Google Earth for verification, so that it does not fall over the constrained regions, or neither it should be very close to the urban areas. It can be very clearly seen that this particular proposed new airport zone is falling over a fairly gentle sloping land with lot of open spaces and open forest, and also there is a close connectivity of the roads which is there. It can be seen by the red lines on the western side of the proposed area. That means the connectivity is also there to the new airport. Having identified the three zones, now we have a overall view of the economic, industrial and airport regions, and these are shown respectively in the orange, brown and magenta colors. These zones meet all the defined criterias of the planning and the constraints which are there, and one can see that these zones do not encroach over unsuitable regions. Now, coming to the salient features of the design that has been proposed, it is observed that it is based on a logical and scientific approach for identifying the zones. Specifically, when urban areas are to be developed, one of the very common techniques used is the annular ring pattern, and this has been adopted in this particular case. In identifying each zone, the necessary parameters in terms of the minimum area and other connectivities and constraints have been taken into consideration. In order to provide sectorized growth, the approach has been based on buffer zones. The implementation of constraints as per importance have also been undertaken. Data inputs through field visits and GPS observations have also been supplemented in order to provide exact locations to the various developmental zones identified. And finally, the verification of the proposed zones through satellite images on Google Earth has also been undertaken, and this highlights that how properly the zones have been located with the help of GIS based analysis. So, now we look at the summary of the three zones which have been identified. The economic zone, it has an area of 2,230 hectares. The maximum distance from the city is about 14 kilometers, and the minimum distance and the mean distance is about 11. Similarly, for industrial zone, the area identified is about 3,069 hectares with a maximum distance of about 21 kilometers and a mean distance of 17, while the airport has an area coverage of 7,836 hectares with a maximum distance of 27 kilometers from the city center and a mean distance of 21 kilometers from the city center. Now, if we look at each of the salient features which have been taken into consideration while identifying the different zones, for economic zone, the salient features are that it is near to the 3 important tourist places which are there, connectivity to the new railway line, it is close to the 400-year highway which is under construction, it is close to the city center and the cultural center of Vientiane capital, it is also close to the diplomatic area, it is close to the existing airport, and it is also close to Mekong river, so that boating and other water related activities can be undertaken. The next is the industrial zone. This is the proposed location is mainly on agricultural and open forest land. There is a good availability of water in the close vicinity. It has connectivity to the new railway line. It is close to the 450-year highway under construction. It is close to the existing industries, and one of the major aspect of this particular zone is that it requires minimum rehabilitation. Then we look at the airport zone which has been identified. The proposed location is mainly on open forest ground and agricultural areas. The average slope is close to about 20%. Minimum rehabilitation is required. Due consideration to the distance to protected areas have been met. There were certain observations related to the railway line which is being under construction. The proposed railway line meets the desired engineering criteria of gradient. However, the number of road and river and stream crossings may be kept to minimum. The minimum distance between 2 railway stations may have to be increased from 6 to 8 kilometers, being low population density of the country. Provision of a new railway station close to the proposed industrial zone must be there. There should be connectivity between the new airport and the city center, which may be provided in the future, and also while identifying the railway line, considerations for expansion to double track and electrification may be undertaken. So, with this one can now appreciate the importance of GIS and remote sensing based inputs in identifying various zones which are required for various developmental activities. In my next lecture, I shall take up an interesting application of GIS, that is municipal GIS. Thank you.